Go ahead.
We're now in week 3 of ARTM 455. Henry and I are going to talk now about the broad subject of what we call a people strategy. What does that mean? It's how an organization manages its people and how people manage their work. And an organization is defined in its culture is defined by interrelationships, how people work together or don't work together, how work is performed. Is it siloed or is it collaborative across functions? And we're going to talk a little bit about a people strategy, how you manage people, what happens when things go wrong, and then how do you know you're on track? And that's usually done through a performance evaluation process. So let's first talk about defining a people strategy. The leader defines the work environment. If the leader is a top-down autocratic person who says, go do this, do it my way, do it by this time, and don't come back to me with anything but what I want. If you have another idea, I don't want to hear it. There are actually people who manage that way. They may not use those words, but that's essentially what they're telling their employees. And does that work? Is that a healthy environment? And Henry, I'm sure you've seen examples of this.
I have. I don't believe it works. First of all, it might work in the corporate world where people sometimes take jobs because they need to earn money. They need to earn a salary, and that's the place they could use their skills. But in the arts, almost everybody on the staff is in it because of a love for the art form. And therefore, there's a greater emotional attachment to the organization and to work life. And managing in that autocratic way stifles that and frustrates creative people. Also, I have always believed that besides being a manager, this was a debate I had with a manager once who said to me, my board doesn't pay me to be nice or to make my staff happy. That's not how I am evaluated. And I said to that person, probably not evaluated that way either by my board, but in addition to being a boss, I'm a human being. And the culture that I establish is the place where my employees will spend the majority of their waking hours. And if I had a successful organization in which the employees did not enjoy coming to work, I would consider myself a failure. His response was, well, you're a much nicer person than I am. Maybe. I also would say a large number of the people who work for me have gone on to leadership positions in the field, in part because I treated them well and I stretched them. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too. But to me, the way to get the best out of people and frankly, to simply satisfy the requirements of being a good human being is to treat people with respect. And the truth is, I don't care how smart you are, you don't actually know all the answers.
Henry, I'm going to use a word and you're going to react to it. The word is empathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
I have often said that that is the single most important quality in an arts administrator, a leader. And by empathy, I want to be careful. Some people confuse that with sympathy, feeling sorry for somebody. Oh, I have empathy for his terrible situation. Empathy and sympathy are not the same thing. You can have both at the same time. But empathy means you actually understand why the other person thinks the way they do and the reason behind their thinking, and even more importantly, how they feel. If you have empathy, you can imagine how somebody will respond to your tone of voice. And you can and will, almost by instinct, adjust your tone of voice so that they respond in a positive, receptive manner instead of immediately getting defensive. I think empathy in that meaning where good antennae for people's feelings are essential in leadership.
the culture of the organization that we talked about, how do you create a positive culture where people come to work and enjoy the experience? The first thing I would say is honesty and transparency, and they're not the same. Honesty is where you present things as they are, good or bad. A mistake is made, I made a mistake. And the leader who's empathetic will say, let's understand what that mistake is. And we're going to get a little bit of how you manage that in a minute. But transparency is being open. Don't hold anything back. If an employee is told, I want you to do this, but doesn't understand the context of the assignment, why you want it, how it relates to something else, you're going to get a very narrow result. If in transparency we mean you're open, you are sharing. If the organization is open and sharing, when an assignment is given and there's accountability for that assignment, it's done in the context, a broader context of understanding and knowledge, and the result is far better.
I've had, Ralph, situations where senior managers didn't share, let's say they're working on a project, and they actually might have used input from other people, but they didn't share it yet because they weren't sure of either their facts or where it was going. And they wanted to know that before they opened the discussion to other people. And I worked really hard to change that mindset and say, you will make a better decision if you let people in early in the thinking process. People don't need to be afraid that they might share something that's wrong. They might share an error in thinking. Actually, that's good because somebody will catch it early. But it does involve a certain amount of self-confidence.
And managing for success also means building and maintaining mutual respect. In some organizations, the person in a higher position views the person in a lower position almost in a contemptible way. Well, you work for me. Well, everyone works with everyone else. And while there is a hierarchical reporting system, the mutual respect, the respect each individual has, both in the reporting relationships and across functions, is absolutely essential. If you feel that respect, you feel more confident in bringing in ideas, in identifying a problem before it becomes a big problem, and it generates a much more healthy environment.
I think it's also important to know the personalities. Different people who are working with you will have different personalities. And when I've had people who are, I guess I'll use the word, a little bit insecure and always worried about whether they made a mistake. And then if they made that mistake, they come in and say, oh, I'm almost in tears. Henry, I did this terrible thing. And my first reaction to say, would you like a list of the bad decisions I've made in the last 2 weeks? Here they are. Now let's talk. And that will often set somebody at ease.
Yeah, and I think that as a leader, you have to learn the art of self-confidence, but at the same time, it's not arrogance. There should be a degree of humility in it. How do you manage conflict? That also defines the success of an organization. When people aren't getting along, what do you do as leader? How do you create the opportunity for conflict to be resolved in the most collaborative way? I'm going to share the screen, not spend very much time on this, but you have in Blackboard this schematic of a conversation for managing breakdowns. And I invite you to take a look at this. It's 2 pages long. This is the first page. This is the second. And when you read this, keep this in mind. When a mistake is made, that's what a breakdown is. And how do you manage that breakdown? You can be reactive. You can begin to make excuses. You can find a different interpretation of what happened. And does that really provide an opportunity for learning from a mistake? The answer is no. And what this basically does is it sets out a contrast between how you might manage a breakdown in a very traditional sense, which is confrontational and judgmental, or how do you manage a breakdown where it becomes an opportunity for learning? And what I've always said for people who work for me, everyone is allowed to make a mistake, but we learn from those mistakes. The key is don't make the same mistake twice. So learning from our mistakes is a growth opportunity, and it also is a healthy environment. I'll talk a little. The next aspect of managing success is how do you know you're being successful in that? And the best tool for determining that is the performance evaluation. What is a performance evaluation? It's when a leader sets for the persons who report to him or her, what is it I expect from you in performing your job? How do we establish what success looks like for you? How do we establish how you go about doing your work? And that's all done in a performance evaluation mechanism. And what happens there is the leader will meet with an employee and say, let's evaluate how you are performing, both in terms of success in your function, managing interpersonal relationships within your organization, managing relationships across the organization. And a performance evaluation takes all of those into account. And the first thing you have to do is make sure that the responsibilities are clear. What is it that I do in my job, and what are you holding me accountable for? Is my responsibility aligned with the authority that I have? Are you asking me to do something that I don't have the authority to do? And the worst situation you can ever be in is to put a person in a situation where you're saying, you're responsible for this, but I'm not going to give you the tools and the authority and the confidence in doing it, but I'm going to hold you accountable. That's a mechanism for disaster. So aligning responsibility and authority is very important. That means as a leader, you have to relinquish some authority to the.
If you have a vice president of, I'll say, the development department, the fundraising department, you cannot tell that person who else to hire in the development department, because you've immediately removed that person's authority that is necessary for that person to hold responsibility. You can advise, you can suggest, you can say, I think this is a problem, but in the end, you have to give a senior manager the authority to hire the people under that senior manager.
In the performance evaluation, the other thing that's done is you're setting goals and objectives. In the next year, what are your goals? And they can be business goals. As a development VP, I want to be able to raise X number of dollars that is required under the budget. But it's also, what are my goals as it relates to my relationship with other people, my relationship with my boss, how I manage people. And in the performance evaluation 1 year later, you take those goals and objectives and you now evaluate that individual against the goals and objectives that were established.
But an important part of that is when you set those goals, they are agreed to mutually. In other words, the CEO cannot simply say to the development vice president, your job is to raise $6,200,000 next year.
Good luck.
Right, have fun. And usually, I will tell you in my career, it was always a negotiation because the employee always starts out trying to set the most cautious conservative goal to make certain that they will achieve it. My job was to try to stretch that. So I might start high, but in the end, you have to reach agreement. You cannot force a goal onto somebody that they say to you, I can't make that. And that's a very important part of management.
And toward that, you have to ensure the employee has the tools
right
in order to perform the expectations.
Yep.
And in this process, if you don't have the tools that you think you need in order to accomplish the goal, this is the time to speak up. So, for example, I don't have enough staff, Henry. In order to reach that, I'm going to have to add to my staff. Well, how does the budget look to that? That whole conversation takes place. If you wait a year and say, I missed my objective because I didn't have enough people, well, then you're accountable for not having called it out at the very beginning. And that should not be a conversation that's a difficult one. It should be a collaborative one. And it doesn't just happen once a year in a performance evaluation. Managing people is a continuous feedback of how I'm doing. The boss to the person who works for him or her, and the subordinate, it's a continuous feedback back and forth. And that feedback should also be across. So the development director is working hand in glove with the finance VP. I'm not going to make my goal this month. Well, finance person says, well, I have a cash flow problem. You have to. Don't let that become an issue when it's right in front of you. Understand it as it's developing and have that continuous dialogue.
The continuous dialogue is so important. A performance evaluation that is done once a year and comes as a surprise to the employee is a failed process.
So what we've talked about here is how do you manage an organization for success? What are the behaviors that the leader must exhibit and practice to ensure the most positive work environment?
Thank you.
Thank you, Henry.